object. This is the custom UI default switcher. Now, for instance, we may have created a new layout over here, and this allows us to change what the default one is and so forth. And you can see down here it explains a little bit about this dialog. So let's just close that down. You can show different elements of the GUI from here, and you can see at the moment 3 of the 4 elements are shown. I'll just turn this on, and you can see that we actually have a number of toolbars which are currently hidden. And again, you can address these by going here, and you can also toggle them from here as well. So you can hide various elements. Now you can see I've got axis constraints showed, so we'll just untick that to hide that again. And you can see we've got layers and extras here, so we'll just do the same for layers and the same for extras. There we go. And we'll do the same for Chris Toolbar. And now that's hidden Chris Toolbar over here. If I right click on that and click on that again, you can see it's brought up Chris Toolbar. So for now we'll just hide that again. Something that's quite easy to do is to accidentally move an element of your GUI. So if you're happy with your GUI and you're prone to moving bits around it, accidentally, you can lock GUI with this particular item here. So that's quite useful. Configure paths. This is quite a main configuration element of Max. Here you can set up the default paths that Max will use to find various elements. As an example, if you go to the material editor and go to load a bitmap image, Max will automatically look in this path here. Same thing if you created a preview of an animation, Max would by default save it out to this path here. So you can modify these paths and then customize Max so it saves and loads elements from different areas on your setup. This tab here allows you to set up which plugins are used, and Max will search into any directories that you have specified here and load up any bitmaps that you have specified. So you can see at the moment we're just using the default standard plugins and also the plugins from the plugin directory. These are both standard, so there's nothing special about this particular setup of Max. And here you can set up various other elements where it'll find external files and where it'll find xrefs. So again, these are search paths for external files and xref. So again, pretty useful stuff. Unit setup. This is something I really wouldn't change when you're working with Max. It's something of a mistake to actually change the units in some ways, I find. It's much better to actually think of the standard Max unit, which we'll see here. If we click on this teapot and go to modifiers, you can see that it has a radius of 34.687 units. Now the question is, what are those units? Are those millimeters or meters or kilometers? Well, the truth of the matter is they're whatever you want it to be. And generally it's a good idea never to change the units from here. You've got options of changing them to American or international. Just leave them as international and leave them as generic. Don't change them to metric or US standard or anything like that. Just leave them as the standard setting. What this allows you to do is that if you load the file into another copy of Max, if you've changed the generic units to anything else other than the generic setting, Max will then try to rescale those objects to be the correct scale for that scene. And the problem with that is that any rig that you may have set up that is scale dependent will generally be broken. So you're not really gaining anything by doing that. So it's generally something that's best avoided. As I said, just say to yourself, we're working on a project which is a model of, let's say, London. It's a very big model, so we need a very large basic unit to model London. Now, if it's going to model all of London, which is, say, some 35 miles across, you need a very big unit there. So you could say that one unit equals a kilometer, or if you wanted a little bit more detail, you could say one unit is 100 meters or maybe even meters. But once you start using meters on a model as big as a city, even that unit size is not really that good. So do some R&D, find out what scale works for you. It works at the opposite scale as well. If you're working on a very tiny little scene, little insects or even bacteria, again you have to really decide what your scale is. And also, a lot of the times a definite scale isn't that important. If you're working with bacteria, unless you're working directly with scientists and they're sitting next to you, telling you that particular bacteria is, 100 microns across or wherever, it really doesn't matter that much as long as, the relative scales of things are correct on screen. So, there's a tip. In production, don't change the basic unit setup. Just leave it as is and, just work with the scale that you've decided to work with. Okay, below that we have grids and snaps. Here you can basically turn on the different grids and snap options. And you can also change the scale of angle snaps. So for instance, at the moment it's using the default 5 degrees, which I generally find is actually quite a good level. And you can just, customize this to be whatever you want it to be. You can see at the moment you've got the home grid, which is here, set to have a grid spacing of 10, and you've got major grid lines every 10 units. So, and you can also change the size of that grid. So there we go. We can make the grid different sizes. So let's just put that back to the default. Okay, cool. Next we have viewport configuration. We'll bring this up, and this is exactly the same dialog as the viewport configuration that you saw here. So it's just another way of getting to that particular dialog. Below that you have plugin manager, which was introduced I think in Max 4. And this allows you to set up whether plugins are loaded when Max is loaded, or whether they're deferred. If they're deferred, basically that means that Max won't automatically load them when it loads. It'll wait until you actually specifically use that plugin, then it will actually load the plugin into memory. This is just a way of optimizing the way Max works, and it can save quite a lot of memory. You can see I've actually got the biped plugin here, and you can see it's actually using what appears to be, I think it's 10 megabytes of memory. So you can see, if you have a lot of plugins, that can actually add up to quite a lot of memory usage for, not much use really, because some of these plugins may never be used in a particular scene. So you can set up that there. And finally at the bottom we have preferences. This brings up quite a key dialog in Max. Here you've got various options for customizing pretty much anything in Max. This is not so much customization, you can tell by the dialog. This is more about preferences, how exactly do you want Max to work. So as an example, we've got levels of undo here. And as you saw earlier, undo is very useful. But as an example, let's say you were converting a mesh from one type to another, and every time you converted that mesh, it was using, say, 300 megabytes of memory to do that. Let's say you have a model of a city and it's 3 million polygons, 4 million polygons. Every time you modify one part of that city, it may use up, like I said, 300 megabytes. Well, if you've got 20 levels of undo and you're making 300 megabyte changes with every change that you make in Max, you're very quickly going to run out of memory. So you can actually go into here and put the undo levels down to 0, if you're working on something very temporarily, and Max literally won't do a conversion because of the amount of memory that it's using. You can just knock it down there. You can see you have options for general options, files, viewports, gamma correction, rendering, animation settings, preferences for mental ray, radiosity, max script, gizmos, and inverse kinematics. So as an example, gizmos that we've been using, if it just closes for a second, the gizmos that we've been seeing here, you can actually turn those off if you really don't like them, and you can just use keyboard shortcuts to achieve the same thing. And you can do that there in the gizmo tab, so you can see gizmos off, and you can change the size of the gizmos and whatever really, So there's a lot of scope there for changing your preferences with Max. Right to the right of the customize menu, we have the Max script menu. This is something that we'll actually be dealing with in a specialist DVD in our series. So I won't go into that in a great deal of detail at the moment, but let's just give you a quick example of what you can do with it. I've turned on the macro recorder here. What that means is that when I open up the Max script listener, and if I change anything in the scene, it will actually be input here. You can see it's actually outputting here. So I click on the viewport, it's saying clear selection. Let me make this a little bit bigger. If I click on the teapot, you can see it's saying select teapot 2. Click on this teapot, select teapot 4. So you can see for every action that you do, pretty much every action in Max anyway, there is a Max script output. And you can use that output as the basis for a script. And you can also use that output as the basis for a macro button. So as an example, let's bring up Chris's toolbar again. There we go. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a very basic script that will quite simply change the segmentation of a teapot, and we'll change the radius to say 30, dead on 30. So that'll be quite an interesting little thing to see. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to get the command for changing the radius. So we'll just change that to 30 here, and you can see it's brought up the command here. You can also see that these are all instances, so as I'm doing this, they're all changing. And then the segmentation, let's just change that